Director Sean Baker first got on my radar in 2015 when his movie Tangerine made a big splash at Sundance. Part of the reason it made a big splash is because it was shot on 3 iPhones. A handful of movies since have been shot on iPhones. Soderbergh's made 2, 28 years later is coming out this summer, that was shot on iPhone 15s, but this was one of the first. Plus it was 2015, so it was shot on an iPhone 5. That movie is centered around 2 transgender sex workers on Santa Monica Boulevard on Christmas Eve. It's a movie about people we don't often see on screen struggling to get by. Sean Baker's next movie was The Florida Project in 2017. That takes place at a shitty motel in Orlando just outside Disney World, managed by Willem Dafoe in an Oscar-nominated performance. When The Florida Project came out, I learned of a term called the hidden homeless, which is people and families that live hand to mouth and can't afford first and last month's rent at a traditional apartment, so they live semi-permanently in these dingy motel rooms and pay week to week. You get the sense that it's a small step up from living in your car. It is a movie about people we don't often see on screen, struggling to get by, up to and including performing sex work. Sean Baker's most recent movie was called Red Rocket in 2021. I learned yet another term from that movie, and that is suitcase pimp. Men who are vaguely or explicitly involved in the pornography industry who go around recruiting girls to get into porn. Red Rocket takes place in a rundown small town in Texas where there presumably used to be industry, and it is, once again, a movie about people we don't often see on screen struggling to get by. I hope you're seeing a pattern here. Sean Baker makes unassuming movies shining a light on the humanity of people on the outskirts of society, where the money is hard to come by and hard earned. The outskirts of society thing is kind of a key piece here. Tangerine takes place in and around Hollywood, and even though geographically it's only a few blocks away, it feels a million miles from the glitz and glamour of the Chinese and Dolby theaters where red carpets and the Oscars take place. The Florida Project takes place just outside of Disney World, but it feels a million miles from the happiest place on earth. Red Rocket features characters on the outskirts of the multi-billion-dollar porn industry, but it feels a million miles from even the McMansions in the San Fernando Valley. Anora is very much a Sean Baker movie. It's all of these things you see in his last movies, but a bit bigger in scope. Manhattan strip clubs, expensive Brighton Beach houses, Coney Island, Las Vegas wedding chapels, the swankiest penthouses you've ever seen, and this wonderful sequence at Caesar's Palace that was featured so heavily in the marketing. Mikey Madison plays the titular Anora, who goes by Annie throughout the movie. She's a stripper in Manhattan, tasked with entertaining a young, wealthy Russian guy at the club because she speaks a little Russian. This Russian guy, Vanya, played by Mark Edelstein, is quite taken with Annie and asks if she works outside the club. Annie goes to Vanya's swanky Brighton Beach house for some extracurricular activities. I'll pause here to say that the face of the Academy has changed dramatically in the last decade. They've expanded their membership a lot, so there's a lot more people and younger people. And with this new Academy, the concept of an Oscar movie has been evolving. To that point, this movie is far more overtly sexual and has more sex scenes than I've ever seen in a Best Picture winner or presumptive frontrunner. They're not gratuitous, like I would argue that every lap dance and sex scene definitely has a narrative purpose and reveals something about a character, but there's just a lot here, so FYI. During Annie's extracurricular activities at Vanya's Brighton Beach house, we learn that he is the immature son of Russian oligarchs who is quite enjoying being carefree and rich in the United States, but who must eventually go back to Russia. He hires Annie to be his girlfriend for the week, and they fly private to Vegas to party with his friends. There, he and Annie impulsively get married in a half-baked scheme to let Vanya stay in America and avoid going back to Russia. When word of this gets to Vanya's handlers in the area, who are ostensibly watching over him on behalf of his Russian oligarch parents, things go awry quickly. The opening 15 minutes or so are constructed to really endear you to Annie. And it shows the work of a stripper is less about dancing and much more about salesmanship and being friendly and flirty and knowing who to approach and how to approach and when to touch their arm and when to suggest they go to the VIP. Annie is extremely savvy and tactful and great at reading people and knowing the right thing to say. And yes, she's a great actress. She's putting on a performance whenever she's on the job. She's playing a character. As you can imagine, there's a huge disconnect between her personality and vibe at the club and her personality and vibe and the glimpses we get of her everyday life. And one of the wonderful aspects of Mikey Madison's performance is how she is absolutely on the job and putting on that performance when she is first at Vanya's house. And she's still in hustle mode and making sure she's still being compensated even as Vanya wants to spend more and more time with her. But she does slowly start to pull back on the performance and be more of her real self, as if to convince herself that this relationship is real and not just an extension of the carefully curated fantasy she creates for her clients. Mikey Madison really is sensational in this. Not only for her performance within the performance, where Annie is in savvy, tactful, endearing hustler mode, but also for the scenes where she's dropped that act and she's a complete firecracker who doesn't take shit from anyone. But even the firecracker is a bit of a performance too. It's a defense mechanism, and that has its limits and eventually comes down as well. This character in this performance is like an onion. Every time you think you have her figured out, she peels back another layer. And not for nothing, a lot of these scenes play out in pretty long takes without many cuts, so it's not like Mikey Madison's performance could be constructed in the edit from many takes. Sean Baker is just rolling the camera and letting her cook for minutes at a time. Over Christmas, my sister-in-law was politely asking me about what movies came out this year and what she should be on the lookout for Oscars-wise, and Anora was the first movie I mentioned. At the time, it seemed like the Best Picture frontrunner, but then it kind of didn't anymore in January and most of February, but now it does again. This is certainly your frontrunner. And when I gave my sister-in-law the logline and the pitch of the movie, she was like, "Oh, so it's like Pretty Woman." And like, no, not really. I totally see how it seems that way on paper, but this isn't that. Or rather, let me put it this way. Go to the Wikipedia page for Pretty Woman and you'll see that it was originally intended to be a dark cautionary tale about class and sex work in Los Angeles, but the film was reconceived as a romantic comedy with a larger budget. And that's the big difference here. Vanya in this movie is a far, far cry from Richard Gere. And I'm not sure there's ever a point where you're rooting for these two kids to actually make it. Or like, you are, but only insofar as that it helps out Annie and gives her a better life, not because you think like they go well together or see much romance here. This is very transactional and much more cynical about relationships and their usefulness. After Annie and Vanya get married, she goes to the club to announce her retirement and clean out her locker. And while there, her coworker says she's like Cinderella. And she is. Like Cinderella, she gets a taste of the finer things in life. And you cheer for that because I guess in some sense you kind of feel like she deserves it. But the whole deal with Cinderella is that the glitz and glamour is temporary. The carriage turns back into a pumpkin at midnight. It's a fairy tale. None of this feels real, much as Annie tries to convince herself that it is. And it's heartbreaking not for the loss of romance, but for the loss of economic mobility. Someone who works hard and lives in a shitty Brooklyn apartment with a roommate seems to have finally worked her way up to the finer things in life, cynical as that may be. The socioeconomic barriers that separate the haves and have-nots come down briefly, but are built back up in the second half of the movie. For me, there's at least three really remarkable things about Anora. One, Mikey Madison's performance. Probably the best I've seen in a Sean Baker movie, and that's saying something, and certainly one of the best of the year. Two, yet another example of Sean Baker's signature ability to shine a light on people struggling to get by, people who are almost never shown on screen with this much humanity.
I'll tell you what's not funny. Killing strippers. Strippers are people too.
And three, a pretty impressive breadth of tone here. Sexy strip club scenes, scenes with outrageous Buster Keaton-esque physical comedy, and then like the middle third is a very stressful search for a missing character that I've seen compared tonally to Uncut Gems. And then, of course, there are scenes that are pretty profoundly depressing in regards to the power dynamics of people who have money and people who don't. Vanya's parents and the people who work for them do not see Annie as a person. In fact, one of them calls her an animal multiple times. Instead, they see Annie as a supreme inconvenience, a leech that has attached herself to Vanya that they feel they must pry off of him. But the thing about Vanya is that he sucks. Who is really the leech here? Who is allowed to be a leech because of the circumstances of their birth? And who must hustle and sell themselves and work to get access to this life? Who is or isn't granted to living in comfort and luxury? One unlikely character begins to see Annie's humanity, and that's one of the Russians tasked with breaking up her and Vanya, a stooge named Igor, played by Yuri Borisov, Oscar nominated. Like the audience, the more time Igor spends with Annie, he begins to see how fucked up the situation is, how they're attempting to throw her away like trash for the benefit of this shitty kid and his shitty parents. Anora won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in May, and if it wins Best Picture, it'll be only the fourth movie to win both prizes. most recent being Parasite 5 years ago, and the second most recent being Marty 69 years ago. I do think it's notable comparing this award season to Parasite's year in 2019, because that year also featured several prominent movies explicitly about the divide between people with money and people without money, and how the former routinely and systematically screws over the latter. This year, the two best movies in this batch of nominees are both playing in the same sandbox. I don't know, maybe there's something in the air, maybe in the current geopolitical landscape that's making people respond to this kind of thing. Who's to say? Maybe more than anything else, I'm excited that Sean Baker is getting his flowers. Here's a guy who's been really grinding for years, making very interesting movies that no one else really seems interested in making. And for that reason, he has to really will them into existence. On all of his movies, he produces, writes, directs, and edits the thing himself. He even casts people that he finds on Instagram or just walking the street. To cast his female lead in Red Rocket, he literally just saw Susanna Sung walking on Sunset Boulevard and said, "You have an interesting look, here's my card." By the way, if you are a young woman walking around Hollywood and someone claiming to be a casting director hands you his card, unless that person is literally Sean Baker, maybe proceed with caution. When he accepted the Palme d'Or, Sean Baker said, "This literally has been my singular goal as a filmmaker for the past 30 years, so I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with the rest of my life." What I hope he does is continue to make thoughtful, funny, sad, exciting, empathetic movies like this.